Arthur Sinclair sat in his office, the expansive view of his Napa Valley vineyard stretching endlessly beyond the glass windows. The afternoon sun bathed the rolling hills in golden light, but Arthur's thoughts were far from serene. His daughter Claire had crossed the line again. The reports from his private investigator sat open on his desk, detailing her latest rebellion. Claire was dating some lowlife, a no-good rebellious kid from Los Angeles who had a knack for causing trouble. Arthur clenched his jaw. He had given her everything: wealth, education, opportunities, and this was how she repaid him. He had tried reasoning with her, but Claire had always been headstrong, pushing against every boundary he set. After her mother, Eleanor, passed away, Arthur had taken it upon himself to control every aspect of her life. He believed it was the only way to protect her, to keep her safe from the dangerous world beyond their lavish estate. But now his control seemed to be slipping away. This wasn't just about a boy anymore. It was about respect. Arthur refused to let Claire throw her future away on some foolish romance with a man who had no prospects. He needed to teach her a lesson, one she wouldn't forget. Arthur's thoughts darkened as he formulated a plan, one so severe it would force Claire to reconsider her choices. He picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. "Ethan, I need to speak with you," Arthur said when the line connected. Ethan Miller, the family's gardener, was as reliable as the sunrise. He had worked on the Sinclair estate for years, tending to the vineyards and gardens with a quiet diligence. He was a simple man, someone who never asked for more than his modest wages and the satisfaction of a job well done. And he was about to become a pawn in Arthur's game. A few minutes later, Ethan arrived at the office. He knocked on the doorframe before stepping in, removing his cap as he always did out of respect. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Sinclair?" Ethan asked, his tone polite but wary. Arthur looked him over. Ethan was in his early 30s, rugged from years of outdoor work, with a demeanor that radiated calm. He was everything that Claire despised: unambitious, humble, and without the slightest desire for a life of luxury. But that's exactly what made him perfect for Arthur's plan. "Yes, Ethan. I have a proposition for you," Arthur began, leaning back in his leather chair. "It involves my daughter, Claire." Ethan frowned, clearly confused. "Claire?" Arthur nodded, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to reveal his plan. "I'm sure you've noticed her behavior lately. She's been reckless, irresponsible, making decisions that could ruin her future. And I can't allow that." Ethan remained silent, though his frown deepened. He knew Claire, of course. Everyone on the estate did. She was beautiful, intelligent, and willful, the kind of woman who didn't hesitate to make her displeasure known. "I want her to learn responsibility, Ethan. I want her to understand that life isn't all about indulgence and defiance," Arthur continued. "So, I've decided that she will marry you." The room seemed to still, and for a moment, Ethan looked like he hadn't heard correctly. "Marry me?" he repeated, incredulity clear in his voice. "Yes. You're a good man, Ethan. Hard-working, dependable. You represent everything Claire needs to learn. She'll see firsthand what life is like for people who aren't handed everything on a silver platter. And you," Arthur paused, his tone softening slightly, "you'll be compensated handsomely, of course." Ethan stared at Arthur, his expression unreadable. "But sir, I'm just a gardener. Claire, she doesn't even like me. This doesn't seem right." Arthur waved a hand dismissively. "It's not about like, Ethan. It's about discipline. You'll be doing her a favor in the long run. She needs to grow up, and you'll help her do that." Silence stretched between them, the weight of Arthur's words hanging in the air. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing out the window as if the vineyards might offer some escape from the situation he was now a part of. "I don't know, Mr. Sinclair," Ethan began, but Arthur cut him off. "You don't have a choice," Arthur said firmly. "Neither of you do." Ethan lowered his gaze, understanding that there was no point in arguing. Arthur Sinclair had made up his mind, and when Arthur Sinclair made a decision, there was no reversing it. Later that evening, Claire returned home after a day out in the city. She strolled through the grand entrance of the mansion, her heels clicking against the marble floors, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the scenes. Arthur was waiting for her in the drawing room, seated with an air of authority that Claire immediately recognized as a sign that something was wrong. "Claire!" he called as she passed by. She sighed, her frustration already bubbling to the surface. "What now, Dad? I'm not in the mood for one of your lectures." Arthur stood up, his gaze cold and unyielding. "There won't be any more lectures, Claire. You've made your choices, and now you'll face the consequences." Claire raised an eyebrow, folding her arms across her chest. "What are you talking about?" "You're getting married," Arthur said, his voice calm but decisive. Claire blinked, taken aback. "Married? To who?" "To Ethan Miller, the gardener," Arthur replied, his eyes never leaving hers. Claire's shock turned to fury in an instant. "What? Are you out of your mind? You can't be serious." "I'm very serious, Claire," Arthur said, his tone final. "The wedding is in 2 days. You will marry Ethan, and maybe then you'll learn what it means to live in the real world." The 2 days leading up to the wedding felt like a blur to Claire, filled with disbelief and rage. She had tried everything, pleading, arguing, even threatening to run away, but nothing worked. Her father had made up his mind, and there was no changing it. Arthur Sinclair was a man of control, and this was just another example of how he ruled over her life, dictating every step she took. Claire stood in front of the large mirror in her bedroom, staring at her reflection. Her white dress was simple, nothing like the grand wedding gown she had imagined wearing someday. Her hair was pinned up neatly, but it lacked the sparkle of excitement that any bride should have on her wedding day. There was no joy, no anticipation, just a hollow sense of dread. "I can't believe this is happening," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. Her reflection stared back at her, emotionless. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, the perfect backdrop for a picturesque ceremony in the sprawling gardens of the Sinclair estate. But to Claire, it might as well have been raining. She felt trapped, a prisoner in her own life, forced into a marriage that was nothing more than a punishment. A knock at the door broke through her thoughts. It was her father, of course, coming to make sure she hadn't changed her mind or tried to escape. "Claire!" Arthur's voice was stern as he entered the room. "It's time." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You know this is wrong. You know that, right?" Arthur didn't flinch. "It's for your own good, Claire. You'll see that in time." She clenched her fists, holding back the urge to scream. There was no point in fighting him anymore. She would have to go through with this, but she swore to herself that she would make him regret it. As she followed him downstairs and out into the garden, where a small group of guests had gathered, Claire's mind raced. She could already feel the weight of the life she was about to step into, a life with Ethan, a man she barely knew and didn't love. It was humiliating, and yet it was happening whether she liked it or not. Ethan stood by the archway, looking as out of place as she felt. He was dressed in a simple suit, his usually rugged appearance somewhat softened by the formality of the occasion. But even in his awkward stance, there was a calmness about him, a kind of acceptance that Claire found infuriating. How could he just go along with this? The officiant waited, smiling warmly as if this were any other joyful occasion. Claire had to stop herself from rolling her eyes. There was nothing joyful about this. She barely listened as the ceremony began, her mind wandering to thoughts of escape, anything to avoid the future that was being forced upon her. Ethan's voice, calm and steady, broke through her reverie as he recited his vows. He looked directly at her, and for a moment, Claire saw something in his eyes that startled her. He wasn't happy about this either. Of course he wasn't. Why would he be? He hadn't asked for this any more than she had, and yet he was going through with it. He was fulfilling his role just as she was. When it was her turn to speak, the words felt heavy on her tongue, foreign. "I do," she finally whispered, the phrase barely audible. And just like that it was done. She was now Mrs. Ethan Miller. She realized she didn't even know if that was his last name. As the ceremony concluded, the small group of onlookers clapped politely, but there was no celebration, no warmth. This was a transaction, nothing more. Claire glanced at her father, who stood with his arms crossed, a look of satisfaction on his face. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he had ruined her life, but all she could manage was a cold glare. Ethan approached her, offering his arm as they walked back toward the house. Claire hesitated before taking it, the gesture feeling forced and uncomfortable. They walked in silence, neither of them knowing what to say. Once they were inside, Arthur wasted no time in addressing them. "You'll move into the guest house," he said, his tone businesslike. "It's modest, but it will suit you both." Claire shot him a look of pure venom. "Of course it's modest. That's the whole point, isn't it?" Arthur ignored the jab. "You'll live there together as husband and wife. It's time you learn what life is really like, Claire." She wanted to argue, but the weight of the day had already drained her of the energy to fight. Instead, she simply nodded, resigned to her fate. Ethan remained silent throughout the exchange, his expression neutral. Claire couldn't tell what he was thinking, but at this point she didn't care. She just wanted to be alone. Without another word, she turned and headed toward the guest house, leaving Ethan and her father behind. The guest house was small compared to the mansion, but it was still much larger than anything Claire had ever lived in outside of her family's estate. She walked through the front door and immediately felt the weight of the situation settle over her. This was her new life. No more luxury, no more freedom. She was stuck here with Ethan, in this small house that now felt like a prison. Ethan entered a few moments later, closing the door behind him softly. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this isn't what you wanted." Claire spun around, her eyes flashing with anger. "What I wanted? None of this is what I wanted." She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "But I guess that doesn't matter, does it? We're stuck in this now." Ethan nodded, his face somber. "I suppose we are." For a long moment they stood there in silence, neither one knowing how to move forward. The weight of their forced union hung heavy in the air, and Claire knew that no matter how hard she tried, things were never going to be the same. Claire woke up the next morning feeling the same sense of disbelief and anger that had gripped her the day before. The small guest house, with its quaint decor and cozy atmosphere, was nothing like the mansion she had grown up in. Instead of the luxurious silk sheets and oversized windows she was used to, she found herself in a modest room with plain white curtains and a simple bed that squeaked whenever she moved. For a few moments, she lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that this was all just a nightmare. But the sound of clanging dishes from the kitchen reminded her that it wasn't. It was real. She was married to Ethan Miller, the gardener, and there was no escaping it. Sighing heavily, she threw the covers off and made her way to the bathroom. As she splashed cold water on her face, Claire caught her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes puffy from lack of sleep. She barely recognized herself. This wasn't the Claire Sinclair she knew, the confident, carefree young woman who could get anything she wanted with a snap of her fingers. This was someone else entirely, someone trapped in a life she never asked for. When she emerged from the bedroom, Ethan was already sitting at the small kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as she entered, offering her a quiet, almost hesitant smile. "Morning," he said softly. Claire ignored him, moving to the fridge to grab a bottle of water. She wasn't in the mood for polite conversation, especially not with the man who was now technically her husband. It didn't matter how nice or considerate Ethan seemed. She hadn't forgotten the position she was in, and she wasn't about to make it easy for him. "You should eat something," Ethan continued, his voice gentle but persistent. "I made eggs." Claire glanced at the plate of scrambled eggs he had set on the table. It looked decent enough, but she had no appetite. Instead, she took a long sip of water and then placed the bottle down on the counter with a loud thud. "I'm not hungry," she said flatly. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable, and returned to his coffee. The silence between them was thick and uncomfortable, the awkwardness of their situation hanging in the air like an invisible weight. Claire could feel his eyes on her, but she refused to meet his gaze. She needed to get out of the house, to escape the suffocating feeling that was creeping up on her. Without saying a word, she grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door and walked outside, slamming the door behind her. The fresh air hit her face, bringing a momentary sense of relief, but it wasn't enough to chase away the frustration that had built up inside her. The guest house was nestled at the edge of the sprawling vineyard that stretched for miles across the estate. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the neatly arranged rows of grapevines, and the distant mountains provided a stunning backdrop. It should have been beautiful, peaceful even, but Claire felt none of that. She began to walk, her steps quick and purposeful, as if putting distance between herself and the house would somehow ease the anger churning inside her. She didn't know where she was going, but she didn't care. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in that house any longer, trapped with Ethan and the reality of what her life had become. As she wandered through the vineyard, memories of her old life flooded her mind. Shopping in Beverly Hills, extravagant dinners with friends, luxury vacations on private islands. Everything she had taken for granted was now out of reach. Her father had ripped it all away from her with this ridiculous punishment, and now she was stuck in this nightmare. She kicked at the dirt, sending small pebbles flying into the vines. "This is so stupid," she muttered to herself. "I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be stuck with him." For a while, she just walked, letting the vineyard stretch out around her like a maze of green and gold. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, she knew she couldn't avoid the inevitable forever. Eventually, she would have to return to the house. Ethan would still be there, quiet and patient, waiting for her to acknowledge his existence. She hated how calm he was, how he seemed to accept this situation without complaint. It was infuriating. By the time she made her way back to the guest house, the kitchen was empty. Ethan had cleaned up the breakfast dishes and disappeared, probably out in the garden working. Claire felt a twinge of guilt, knowing he had made an effort to be kind, but she quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't about being nice. This was about her life being ruined, and no amount of scrambled eggs was going to fix that. She wandered into the living room and flopped down onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. The hours passed slowly, each one dragging into the next as Claire tried to figure out what she was supposed to do now. There were no more parties to attend, no more shopping sprees to plan. Her days of luxury were over, at least for the foreseeable future. As the sun began to set, she heard the door creak open, and Ethan stepped inside. His face flushed from a day's work in the garden. He wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced over at Claire, his eyes searching her face for some sign of what she wasn't sure. "I'm going to make dinner," he said after a moment. "You're welcome to join me." Claire didn't respond. She just stared at him, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression blank. Ethan waited for a beat, then turned and headed to the kitchen without another word. The sound of pots clattering filled the silence, and for a moment, Claire considered leaving again, just to escape the awkwardness. But something kept her there, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As she sat there, listening to the familiar sounds of cooking, Claire realized something. Ethan wasn't fighting her. He wasn't pushing back against her anger or resentment. In fact, he seemed to be giving her space, allowing her to process everything in her own time. It was infuriating and confusing, but at the same time, there was a strange comfort in it. Still, Claire wasn't ready to soften. Not yet. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not when she was determined to make this as difficult as possible. If her father thought she would just accept this marriage and move on, he was wrong. Very wrong. Claire woke the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, a far cry from the hum of traffic and city life she was used to. For a brief second, she forgot where she was, until reality hit her like a punch to the gut. She was still in the guest house, still stuck in this forced marriage with Ethan, and nothing had changed. She sighed and sat up, pushing her hair away from her face. Through the small window, she could see Ethan already at work in the garden. He was bent over a bed of flowers, carefully tending to each plant with the same precision he applied to everything. Even from a distance, she could see the concentration etched on his face, as though the entire world faded away when he was working in the soil. Claire stood up and moved to the window, watching him for a moment. She had never understood people like Ethan, people who found satisfaction in such simple things. To her, life was meant to be lived in fast cars, luxurious hotels, and exclusive parties. But to Ethan, it seemed, a day spent in the garden was enough. It didn't make sense to her, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a strange curiosity. What was it like to live a life where nothing was rushed, where everything had its own natural rhythm, where satisfaction came from the earth beneath your feet and the work you put into it? Shaking her head, Claire turned away from the window and went about her morning routine. She wasn't interested in understanding Ethan or his lifestyle. She was just waiting for the opportunity to leave, to go back to her real life, her real world. But that opportunity didn't seem to be coming anytime soon. Later that day, as Claire wandered through the estate, she found herself drawn to the garden where Ethan was working. She had no intention of talking to him, but the sight of him among the plants, moving with a kind of quiet grace, piqued her interest. She kept her distance, watching him from the edge of the garden as he moved from one flower bed to another, his hands deftly pruning and shaping the greenery. Ethan worked with a kind of focus that Claire had never seen in anyone before. It wasn't the same as the driven, cutthroat ambition she had grown up around, her father's world of business deals and high-stakes negotiations. This was different. It was slower, more deliberate, and strangely peaceful. As she watched him, Claire noticed something she hadn't expected. There was no frustration in Ethan's movements, no rush to get the job done. Every action seemed purposeful, as though he took pleasure in the process itself, not just the end result. He would pause every so often to wipe the sweat from his brow or examine a plant more closely, as if the world outside the garden didn't exist. She found herself oddly fascinated by the way he worked. There was something calming about it, even though she still didn't understand how he could be content with such a simple life. After a while, Ethan seemed to sense her presence and looked up, catching her eye from across the garden. He straightened, brushing the dirt off his hands, and gave her a small smile. "Hey," he said, walking over to where she stood. "Didn't think you'd be out here." Claire shrugged, crossing her arms over her chest. "Didn't have anything better to do." Ethan nodded, glancing back at the garden. "Guess that's fair. It's not exactly exciting around here, but it's peaceful." "Peaceful," Claire echoed, her tone almost mocking. "Is that really what you want? Just peace?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "I guess so. I've never really wanted more than that." Claire looked at him, incredulous. "You've never wanted anything more? No ambitions? No dreams?" Ethan smiled, but there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes, something Claire couldn't quite place. "Ambition isn't really my thing. I like knowing I can wake up every day and do something I love. There's something satisfying about seeing something grow, knowing you had a hand in making it happen." Claire frowned. She couldn't understand how someone could be content with so little. But then again, Ethan didn't seem like the type to chase after wealth or status. He was different. "You don't get bored?" she asked, genuinely curious. Ethan laughed softly. "Not really. There's always something to do, something to fix, something to grow. It's not boring when you appreciate the little things." Claire didn't respond. She wasn't sure how to process what Ethan was saying. The little things. She had never cared about the little things. Life was supposed to be big and grand, full of excitement and luxury. But as she stood there, watching Ethan talk about the garden, she realized that maybe she had been missing something. Not that she was ready to admit that, of course. "Well, good for you, I guess," Claire muttered, brushing off the thought. But I still think it's ridiculous. Ethan just smiled, unfazed by her dismissal. You don't have to understand it, Claire. It's just who I am. There was a long pause between them, the sound of the wind rustling through the grapevines filling the silence. Claire shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of Ethan's words settling over her like a blanket she didn't want but couldn't shake off. You should try it sometime, Ethan said after a moment, his voice light but sincere. You might be surprised. Claire scoffed, rolling her eyes. Yeah, right. Me. Gardening. Not gonna happen. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Suit yourself. Without another word, he turned and went back to work, leaving Claire standing there, watching him again. She felt something unfamiliar stir inside her, a mixture of confusion and intrigue. She didn't understand Ethan, and part of her didn't want to. But there was another part, a small part, that wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something worth learning from him. But she quickly pushed the thought away. She wasn't going to fall for the simplicity of Ethan's life. She had a world waiting for her, a world of luxury, excitement, and power. This was temporary. Had to be. Yet, as she turned to walk back toward the guesthouse, Claire couldn't help but glance back at Ethan one last time, feeling a tug of something deep within her that she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Days passed in the small guesthouse, and Claire found herself slipping into a routine that was both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. She still felt trapped by the circumstances, still resented the situation her father had forced upon her, but something was shifting. Slowly, against her will, she was starting to notice things she had never cared to see before. It began with the mornings. Claire would wake up to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of the guesthouse. At first, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, dreading the day ahead. But over time, she started to listen to the sounds of the vineyard waking up, to the breeze that rustled the leaves, to the distant hum of life outside the walls she had built around herself. Ethan was always up before her, out in the garden or working around the estate, his quiet presence as steady as the sunrise. And though she had once resented his calm demeanor, now she found it oddly reassuring. He never pushed her, never demanded anything of her. He was just there. Claire still kept her distance, of course. She wasn't about to suddenly embrace this new life or fall into some picture-perfect romance with a gardener. But she couldn't deny that something had changed. One morning, as she stood by the window watching Ethan work, she caught herself feeling a twinge of admiration. He moved through the garden with a kind of grace, his hands skillfully tending to the plants as though he knew them intimately. There was a rhythm to his work, a quiet confidence that came from years of experience. And despite herself, Claire couldn't help but respect it. The transformation was subtle, but it was there. She wasn't quite sure when it started, but little by little, she found herself paying attention to the world around her. The bright colors of the flowers, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of the wind as it swept through the vineyard. These were things she had never noticed before. In her old life, everything had been about speed and indulgence, about getting what she wanted when she wanted it. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, things moved slower. And for the first time, Claire began to wonder if that was such a bad thing. One afternoon, as she sat outside reading a book, Ethan approached her. He was carrying a basket of fresh vegetables, his shirt stained with dirt from a day's work. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, nodding toward the empty chair beside her. Claire shrugged, not looking up from her book. "Do whatever you want." Ethan smiled slightly and took the seat. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly warm either. It was somewhere in between, awkward but familiar, like the quiet you shared with someone you knew well but didn't really know at all. "I've been thinking," Ethan said after a while, breaking the silence, "about you being here. About how things have been." Claire glanced over at him, raising an eyebrow. "Oh yeah. And what have you been thinking?" Ethan didn't look at her directly. Instead, he kept his eyes on the basket of vegetables in front of him, his fingers idly playing with a stalk of celery. "I know this isn't what you wanted." Get that. But I don't know. It doesn't have to be so bad, does it? Claire scoffed, her usual defensiveness kicking in. So bad. Ethan, I'm living in a guest house on my father's estate, married to someone I barely know because I was forced into it. You really think this isn't so bad? Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. I'm not saying it's ideal. But you've been here for a while now. You've seen how things are. Maybe it's not what you're used to, but it's not the worst, right? Claire didn't answer right away. She wanted to snap back at him, to tell him how ridiculous it was to suggest that her situation wasn't terrible. But the words caught in her throat because, the truth was, she wasn't sure anymore. She didn't know how to feel about any of this. Ethan must have sensed her hesitation because he pressed on. I'm not asking you to love it here. I just think, maybe there's something worth appreciating. Something small, you know. Claire rolled her eyes, but there was no real bite behind it. What, like gardening? Is that what you're suggesting? Ethan smiled again, a little more genuine this time. Maybe. You might be surprised. You're always welcome to join me. Claire shook her head, but she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of her mouth. Yeah, I don't think so. They sat in silence for a while longer, the conversation fading as the day began to cool. Claire watched as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the vineyard. There was something peaceful about the way the light filtered through the trees, the way the air seemed to settle into a quiet hum as evening approached. For the first time, Claire didn't feel the need to leave. She wasn't itching to escape or run back to her old life. She was still angry at her father, still frustrated with her situation, but something inside her had shifted. She was starting to see the world around her differently, starting to notice the beauty in things she had once dismissed. She glanced over at Ethan, who was watching the sunset with a quiet contentment on his face. There was something about him that made her pause, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. He wasn't like anyone she had ever known. He didn't care about wealth or power or status. He cared about simple things, things Claire had never thought twice about. And maybe, just maybe, there was something in that. As the sun finally disappeared behind the hills, Claire stood up, stretching her arms above her head. I'm going inside, she said, her tone casual. Ethan nodded, not looking away from the horizon. All right. See you later. As she walked back to the guest house, Claire realized she didn't hate being here as much as she used to. It wasn't perfect, and she still wasn't sure what her future looked like. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely lost. There was something peaceful about this place, and maybe, just maybe, there was something peaceful about Ethan, too. The days seemed to blur together as Claire continued to live in the quiet solitude of the guest house. Her mornings were filled with the sound of birds and the soft rustle of the vineyard leaves. Ethan's calm, steady presence had become something she expected, like the sunrise or the warm breeze that swept through the fields in the afternoon. But as much as things around her felt peaceful, inside, she was still a storm of emotions. Claire couldn't deny the changes she felt, though. The anger she once harbored so fiercely was softening, and she hated it. She didn't want to let go of that fire. It had fueled her, given her a purpose. But now she found herself questioning everything. What was she still angry about? Her father's manipulation, sure. That much hadn't changed. But her life here with Ethan, that was becoming harder to hate. She sat on the porch one afternoon, her legs curled up under her as she stared out at the vineyard. The sun was warm on her skin, but her thoughts were dark. She hated that she didn't have an easy answer anymore. Before, it had been simple. She resented Ethan, she resented her father, and she resented the entire situation. But now, there were moments when she found herself, not happy exactly, but at peace. And that scared her more than anything. Ethan was out working, as he usually was during the day, and she found herself watching him more and more. Not in a romantic way. She wasn't ready to even consider that, but there was something about him that drew her in. He was so steady, so content with the world he had built for himself. Even though it was small and simple, it was everything she had once despised. Yet now, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than what she had been chasing all these years. Her mind wandered back to the conversation they'd had a few days ago, when he had suggested she might find something to appreciate here. At the time she had scoffed, but now, maybe he had been right. Maybe there was something to be learned from this life. But that realization brought its own set of problems. If she admitted that there was value in this simplicity, what did that say about the person she had been before? Had her entire life up to this point been shallow and meaningless? Claire shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She wasn't ready for that kind of reflection. She had built her identity on being a woman of luxury and status, someone who lived for the finer things in life. And yet, here she was, sitting in a small guest house, thinking about the possibility that those things didn't matter as much as she thought they did. As the day wore on, Claire found herself wandering outside again, unable to sit still. She walked through the vineyard, letting her fingers brush the leaves of the grapevines as she passed. The air was cool now, the sun starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the rows of plants. It was beautiful, in a way she had never really noticed before. When she reached the edge of the property, she found Ethan sitting on a small stone wall, his hands resting in his lap as he looked out over the vineyard. He seemed lost in thought, and for a moment Claire hesitated. She wasn't sure why she had come looking for him, but now that she was here, she didn't know what to say. "Hey," she said softly, stepping closer. Ethan looked up, surprised to see her. "Hey," he replied, giving her a small smile. "Everything all right?" Claire shrugged, not sure how to answer that. "I guess. I just, needed to get out of the house." Ethan nodded, scooting over on the wall to make room for her. "Sit," he offered. She hesitated for a moment but eventually sat down next to him. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound being the soft rustle of the vines and the distant chirping of crickets. It was peaceful, but Claire's mind was anything but calm. "I don't get you," she finally said, her voice breaking the quiet. Ethan turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean? I don't get how you can be so okay with all of this," Claire explained, gesturing around her. "This life. So small. Don't you ever want more?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "I think it depends on what you mean by more. I mean bigger, better, more excitement, more success, more money," Claire said, frustration creeping into her voice. "You're content with so little." "How?" Ethan smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that caught Claire off guard. "I guess it comes down to what you value. For me, it's not about the money or the excitement. It's about the work, about knowing that I'm creating something, growing something. That's enough for me." Claire shook her head, unable to wrap her mind around it. "But don't you feel like you're missing out?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Maybe. To some people it might seem like I am. But I've never felt that way. I think people can get so caught up in chasing more that they forget to appreciate what they have right in front of them." His words hit Claire harder than she expected. She had spent her entire life chasing more. More money, more status, more attention. And now, here she was, sitting with someone who was completely content with so much less. It made her question everything. "I don't know if I can be like that," she admitted, her voice softer now. "I've always needed more." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about being like me, Claire. It's about figuring out what makes you happy, what really matters to you." Claire didn't respond. She didn't know how to. For the first time, she realized that she didn't have an answer to that question. She had spent so long chasing things that didn't really matter, and now that she was forced to confront that, it left her feeling empty. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the vineyard in a warm golden glow, Claire felt something inside her shift. She wasn't ready to admit it yet, but she could feel the edges of her old life starting to blur. And as much as she hated it, there was a part of her that was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Ethan was onto something. Claire paced the small living room of the guest house, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't felt this kind of nervous energy in weeks, not since the day of the wedding. But today was different. Today, she was going to confront her father. The idea had been simmering in her mind for days, ever since that conversation with Ethan by the vineyard. Something had shifted inside her, and though she wasn't entirely sure what it meant yet, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep living under the shadow of her father's control. The thought of facing him filled her with both dread and determination. Arthur Sinclair had always been larger than life, a man whose presence dominated every room he entered. Growing up, she had learned quickly that defying him came with consequences, and this marriage had been the ultimate proof of that. But now, standing in the quiet of the guest house, Claire felt a surge of strength she hadn't felt before. She was tired of living by his rules, tired of letting him dictate her every move. She glanced out the window at the vineyard, where Ethan was working as usual. There was something grounding about his steady presence, even from a distance. Claire knew she didn't have to do this, but she also knew that if she didn't confront her father now, she might never get the chance to break free. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her jacket and headed out the door. The path to the main house seemed longer than usual, the vineyard stretching out like an endless maze of green and gold. Each step felt heavy, like she was walking toward a final showdown that had been building for years. When she reached the front door of the mansion, she paused for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Memories of her life here flashed through her mind. The lavish parties, the high-end fashion, the constant buzz of wealth and power had all seemed so important back then. Now it felt distant, like a different life entirely. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The grand foyer was just as she remembered it, cold and imposing. The marble floors gleamed under the chandelier light, but there was no warmth in the space. It was a monument to her father's success, a reminder of everything he had built and everything he had demanded in return. Arthur was in his office, of course, the place where he spent most of his time these days. Claire could hear the faint sound of his voice through the closed door, probably on a business call. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should wait until he was done. But then her resolve hardened. No more waiting. She knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for a response. Arthur looked up, startled by her sudden entrance. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk, his phone in one hand, papers scattered in front of him. His eyes narrowed when he saw her, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Claire," he said, his tone sharp. "I'm on a call. This better be important." She crossed her arms over her chest, standing her ground. "It is." Arthur held up a finger, signaling her to wait while he finished his conversation. Claire stood there, her jaw clenched, watching as he barked orders into the phone. It was a familiar sight. Her father, the powerful businessman, always in control. But today, Claire wasn't going to let him brush her off. Finally, he hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "What is it you want, Claire?" "I'm busy." She took a deep breath, her heart racing. "We need to talk. About the wedding. About this arrangement." Arthur's expression didn't change, but she could see the flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Oh, is my daughter finally coming to her senses? Ready to beg for an annulment?" Claire shook her head, her voice steady. "No, that's not why I'm here." He raised an eyebrow. "Then what? You've been living in the guest house for weeks now. Surely you're not enjoying it." "I'm not here to talk about what I enjoy," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I'm here to tell you that I'm done letting you control me. You forced me into that marriage because you thought it would teach me a lesson. But it didn't work." Arthur's expression darkened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. Claire took a step closer, feeling her confidence grow. "You thought marrying Ethan would be some kind of punishment, but it's not. I've learned more about myself in the last few weeks than I ever did living under your thumb. And I'm not going to let you keep running my life." Arthur stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "Is that so? And what exactly do you plan to do, Claire?" run off with the gardener and live happily ever after. Claire met his gaze, refusing to back down. Maybe I will. And if I do, it'll be because it's my choice, not yours. Arthur's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. You're being ridiculous. Do you really think you can throw away everything I've built for you? Everything this family has worked for? Claire didn't flinch. It's not your life to control, Dad. It's mine. The tension in the room was thick, neither of them willing to back down. Claire could see the struggle in her father's eyes, the conflict between his desire to control her and the realization that he was losing his grip. You've always been stubborn, Arthur said finally, his voice low. But don't forget who you're dealing with. I'm the one who made this family what it is. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me. Claire shook her head. You gave me everything except the freedom to live my own life. There was a long silence between them, the weight of her words settling in the room. For the first time, Claire saw something shift in her father's expression. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something deeper, something closer to regret. But Arthur was not a man to admit defeat easily. He straightened his shoulders, his voice cold and calculated once more. You want your freedom, Claire? Fine. But don't come crying to me when you realize that life out there isn't as easy as you think. Claire nodded, her heart still racing, but her mind clearer than it had been in years. I won't. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving her father behind. As the door clicked shut behind her, she felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation had been intense, but it was over. She had said what she needed to say, and for the first time in a long time, Claire felt like she was in control of her own life. The confrontation with her father had left Claire feeling a mixture of emotions: anger, relief, and an odd sense of freedom she hadn't expected. For the first time in her life, she had stood up to Arthur, and while the conversation had been tense, it also felt like a turning point. She wasn't entirely sure what her next move was, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going back to the life of luxury and control her father had built for her. When she returned to the guest house, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the vineyard. Ethan was outside, kneeling by one of the flower beds, his hands covered in dirt as he worked with quiet concentration. Claire watched him for a moment, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. It had been weeks since their forced marriage, and though things had been awkward and tense at first, something had shifted between them. Ethan's patience and quiet resilience had surprised her, and over time, she had come to appreciate the simple kindness he showed her. He never pushed her, never asked for anything in return. And now, after the confrontation with her father, she found herself drawn to that quiet stability. Ethan looked up as she approached, wiping his hands on his jeans. You're back, he said, his voice soft but welcoming. How did it go? Claire sat down on the small stone bench near the garden, letting out a long breath. It was intense, she admitted. But I finally told him what I needed to say. Ethan nodded, standing up and walking over to sit beside her. Good. It's about time. Claire smiled faintly, glancing over at him. You think so? Yeah, Ethan said, his tone gentle but firm. You've been carrying that around for a long time. It's good that you finally got it off your chest. Claire leaned back, staring up at the sky as the color shifted from orange to pink. I just don't know what comes next. I feel like I'm floating between two worlds. The life I had before and this one. I don't know where I belong anymore. Ethan was quiet for a moment before he spoke. Maybe you don't have to choose right now. Maybe you can just be. She looked over at him, surprised by the simplicity of his answer. Just be. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yeah. Life doesn't always have to be about making big decisions or having everything figured out. Sometimes it's okay to just live, see where it takes you. Claire thought about that for a moment, her mind turning over the idea. She had always lived with a sense of urgency, a need to be in control, to know exactly what was coming next. But maybe Ethan was right. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers right now. I'm not used to that, she admitted, her voice softer now. I've always had a plan. Even when I was rebelling against my father, I was still chasing something. Ethan leaned back on the bench, his arm brushing against hers as they sat in comfortable silence. I get that. But plans can change. People change. Claire glanced at him, her heart skipping a beat at the way his words seemed to echo something deeper inside her. Over the past few weeks, she had begun to see Ethan in a new light. He wasn't just the gardener her father had forced her to marry. He was kind, patient, and steady, everything she hadn't realized she needed. For the first time, Claire allowed herself to really look at Ethan. He was handsome in a rugged but unassuming way, with his strong jawline and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. But more than that, there was a warmth to him, a quiet strength that she had come to rely on without even realizing it. "What about you?" she asked, turning the conversation back to him. "Do you have a plan?" Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think I've ever had much of a plan. I like things simple. I take life as it comes." Claire smiled, feeling a flutter in her chest that she hadn't expected. "That sounds nice." He looked at her, his expression softening. "It can be." The air between them seemed to shift, and for a moment, Claire felt like the world around them had gone quiet. She hadn't planned on feeling anything for Ethan, but here she was, sitting beside him, her heart racing at the way he was looking at her. "Ethan," she began, her voice hesitant. "About this marriage." He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I know we didn't have a choice," Claire said, her words slow and careful. "And I know things haven't been ideal. But I think I'm starting to see things differently." Ethan didn't say anything, but the way he looked at her made her feel like he already knew what she was trying to say. Claire took a deep breath, her pulse quickening. "I guess what I'm trying to say is, maybe this doesn't have to be a punishment. Maybe we can make it something more." Ethan's eyes softened, and for a moment, the only sound was the gentle rustling of the vineyard in the evening breeze. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. Claire nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yeah, I think it is." Ethan's smile was small but genuine, and he squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." The simplicity of his words filled Claire with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. There were still so many unknowns, so many things she didn't have figured out, but for the first time that didn't scare her. She wasn't alone in this anymore. As the sun set and the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Claire felt a new kind of warmth bloom inside her, one that had nothing to do with the wealth or status she had once chased. This was different. This was real. And for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days after Claire's conversation with Ethan were filled with a new sense of clarity, though not without a lingering hesitation. She had finally admitted to herself that her feelings for Ethan were real, that maybe this forced marriage didn't have to be the punishment she had once believed. But with that realization came the need to make a decision that would change her life completely. She knew the time had come to make things official, to stand in front of Ethan not as two people forced into a marriage by her father's will, but as equals, as partners. It wasn't something she had ever expected for herself, but it was something she had come to want more than anything. One morning, as the sun rose over the vineyard, Claire sat on the porch of the guesthouse, deep in thought. She held a steaming cup of coffee between her hands, the warmth seeping into her skin as she watched the world wake up around her. The vineyard, once a symbol of the confinement she had felt, now felt like home. The quiet, the simplicity, it had grown on her in ways she never could have predicted. But she couldn't stay in this in-between state forever. She had to take control of her life, make the choice she had been avoiding. Her father had forced her into this marriage to teach her a lesson, but now it was up to her to decide whether to stay in it or leave. That afternoon, she found Ethan in the garden, as usual. He was kneeling by one of the flower beds, his hands gently pruning the plants with the same careful attention he always showed. There was something comforting about the way he worked, something that made Claire feel grounded even when her mind was racing. "Ethan," she called softly, stepping closer. He looked up, surprised but not startled. "Hey," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Everything okay?" Claire nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "Yeah, I need to talk to you." Ethan's expression shifted, a mix of curiosity and concern. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't used to being vulnerable, but with Ethan it felt different. Felt safe. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice softer than she intended. "About us. About everything that's happened since the wedding." Ethan remained silent, giving her space to speak. "I know we didn't have a choice in this," she continued, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I know my father forced both of us into this situation. And at first I hated it." "Hated you?" "I hated this place. I hated everything." Ethan smiled faintly, but he didn't interrupt. "But now," Claire went on, "now things are different. I don't feel trapped anymore. I don't feel like this is some kind of punishment. In fact, I think I might actually be happy here." Her words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of them settling between them like a shared secret. Ethan's eyes softened and he took a step closer, his voice gentle. "What are you saying, Claire?" Claire looked down at the ground, gathering her thoughts. "I'm saying that I want this. I want to be here with you. Not because my father forced me into it, but because it's what I choose." Ethan's expression was unreadable for a moment, as if he was processing what she had just said. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, a real, genuine smile that made Claire's heart flutter in her chest. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice quiet but full of hope. Claire nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. "Yeah, I'm serious." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in a sudden rush of emotion, he reached out and pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly against him. Claire closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his embrace and the steady beat of his heart against hers. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," Ethan murmured, his voice full of emotion. Claire laughed softly, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "Neither did I." They stood there for a long moment, the world around them quiet and still. For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire felt truly at peace. There was no more anger, no more resentment, just the quiet understanding that this was where she was meant to be. After a while, Ethan pulled back slightly, his hands still resting on her shoulders. "So, what does this mean?" he asked, his voice full of curiosity. Claire smiled, feeling a sense of excitement she hadn't expected. "It means I want to make this real. I want to renew our vows. On our own terms this time." Ethan blinked, clearly surprised. "You mean?" Claire nodded, her smile widening. "Yeah, I want to marry you. For real." For a moment, Ethan was speechless. Then, a wide grin spread across his face, and he pulled her into another hug, this time lifting her off the ground and spinning her in a circle. Claire laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. When he set her down, Ethan looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, one of pure joy. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Claire smiled, her heart full. "Just say yes." Ethan laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yes, absolutely yes." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the vineyard stretching out around them like a quiet witness to the moment. It was simple, but it was perfect. And for the first time, Claire didn't feel like she was chasing something. She had found exactly what she needed. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, they walked hand in hand back to the guesthouse, talking about the future in a way they hadn't before. It was different now. It was real. And when they reached the house, Claire stopped on the porch, turning to look at Ethan with a smile that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside her. Tomorrow, she said softly. Let's do it tomorrow. Ethan nodded, his eyes shining with happiness. Tomorrow. They stood there, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over them, and Claire knew without a doubt that she had made the right choice. The day after Claire made her decision felt like a fresh start, but not everyone welcomed the news with open arms. Arthur Sinclair had always believed he was in control, that his power and influence could shape the world around him, including his daughter's life. But the events of the past few weeks had shaken that belief, and now, for the first time, he was faced with the reality that he might have lost control entirely. Arthur was sitting in his office, as usual, surrounded by the familiar trappings of his wealth and success. The polished wood of his desk gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, and the scent of rich leather and old money filled the air. It was a space that radiated power, and Arthur had always taken comfort in that. But today there was no comfort, there was only unease. He had been avoiding thinking about Claire ever since their confrontation. He told himself that she was just being stubborn, that she would eventually come to her senses and beg for his forgiveness. But as the days passed and he heard nothing from her, doubt began to creep into his mind. He couldn't understand why she wasn't fighting harder to escape the life he had forced upon her. He had expected her to rebel, to come crawling back, desperate to be freed from the marriage to Ethan. But instead she had done the opposite. She had stayed. And now word had reached him that she was planning to renew her vows with Ethan, this time of her own volition. The thought infuriated him. How could his daughter, his only child, choose a life so beneath her? How could she turn her back on everything he had built for her? Arthur stood abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he stared out the window at the vineyard below. The vineyard had always been a source of pride for him, a symbol of his success. But now it felt like a prison, a place where his daughter had slipped from his grasp. He had tried everything to mold Claire into the person he wanted her to be. He had given her the best of everything: money, education, opportunities. And yet none of it had worked. She was still slipping away from him, choosing a life that, in his eyes, was nothing short of a betrayal. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. He turned to see his assistant, Sarah Peterson, standing in the doorway, her expression cautious. "Mr. Sinclair," she began, her voice hesitant. "Your daughter is here to see you." Arthur's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly masked his emotions. "Send her in," he said, his voice cold and authoritative. Sarah nodded and disappeared down the hallway, and a few moments later, Claire stepped into the office. She looked different, more confident, more at ease with herself than he had ever seen her before. It unsettled him. "Claire," Arthur said, his tone clipped. "What is this about?" Claire took a deep breath, standing tall in front of him. "I'm here to tell you that I'm renewing my vows with Ethan." Arthur's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "So I've heard. And what exactly do you expect me to say to that?" "I'm not here to ask for your permission," Claire replied, her voice steady. "I'm here to tell you because I think you deserve to know. But this is my life, and I'm choosing how to live it." Arthur's eyes narrowed, his temper flaring. "You're choosing to throw everything away. Is that what you're telling me?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Claire said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm choosing a life that makes me happy. A life where I get to be myself." "And what about the life I built for you?" Arthur demanded, his voice rising. "The wealth, the opportunities, everything I've worked for? You're just going to walk away from all of it." Claire met his gaze without flinching. "You built that life for yourself, Dad, not for me. I never asked for any of it." The words hit Arthur like a slap to the face. He had always believed that everything he did was for Claire, that all his hard work and success were for her benefit. But now, standing in front of her, he realized that he had been wrong. He had never considered what she wanted, only what he thought was best for her. "You're making a mistake," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. Ethan is beneath you. He'll never be able to give you the life you deserve. Claire shook her head, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. That's where you're wrong. Ethan is exactly what I need. He's kind, he's steady, and he loves me for who I am, not for what I have. Arthur's hands curled into fists at his sides. You think love is enough. You think you can live on love alone. You're being naive, Claire. I'm being happy, she shot back, her voice filled with more confidence than Arthur had ever heard from her. And I'm not going to let you take that away from me. The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension between them palpable. Arthur stared at his daughter, his mind racing. He had always been able to control her, to bend her to his will. But now, for the first time, he saw that control slipping away. And for the first time, he felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Fear. Fear that he had lost her for good. Claire took a step toward the door, her voice softening slightly. I love you, Dad. I always will. But I need to live my own life now. And I hope one day you'll understand that. Arthur didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat felt tight, and his mind was a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and regret. As Claire turned and walked out of the office, the door closing softly behind her, Arthur was left standing in the silence of his office, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. He had tried to control Claire's life, and in doing so, he had pushed her away. And now, she was gone, choosing a life that had nothing to do with the world he had built for her. Arthur sank into his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the empty space where his daughter had stood. He had always believed that power and control were the keys to success, that if he held on to those things tightly enough, he could shape the world around him. But now he realized that there were some things he couldn't control. And the price for that realization was his daughter. The day Claire had been waiting for arrived with a sense of calm that felt almost surreal. The sun was just beginning to rise over the vineyard, casting a soft golden light across the rows of grapevines, and the air was cool and still. This time, the day felt different from her wedding months ago. Back then, it had felt like a punishment, a consequence of her father's will. Today it felt like freedom. Today she was making her own choice. She stood in front of the small mirror in the guesthouse, adjusting the simple white dress she had chosen for the occasion. It wasn't the grand, extravagant gown she might have once imagined for herself, but it was perfect. It was a reflection of the new life she was about to embrace, a life not defined by luxury or status, but by love and authenticity. Claire took a deep breath, her heart fluttering with anticipation. She hadn't felt this kind of excitement in a long time. The last few weeks had been filled with moments of self-reflection, realizations, and growth. She had come to terms with the fact that the life she once thought she wanted wasn't the life she needed. Ethan had helped her see that, not by forcing her to change, but by simply being himself, a steady, kind presence who showed her that happiness could be found in the simplest things. There was a knock at the door, pulling her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Ethan stood there, dressed in a simple suit, his hair neatly combed. He looked at her with the same calm, loving gaze he had always had, but today, there was something else in his eyes, something deeper, more certain. You look beautiful, Ethan said softly, his smile warm and genuine. Claire felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Thank you, she replied, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. You look pretty good yourself. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, the weight of everything they had been through settling between them like a shared secret. This wasn't just a renewal of vows. It was a new beginning, a beginning they were choosing together. Ready? Ethan asked, holding out his hand. Claire nodded, slipping her hand into his. More than ever. They walked together to the small clearing in the vineyard where the ceremony would take place. It was a simple setup. Just a few chairs, a wooden arch decorated with wildflowers, and the rows of grapevines stretching out behind them. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh earth, and the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze was the only sound that accompanied their steps. There were no guests, no grand celebration. It was just the two of them standing side by side, ready to make this commitment on their own terms. And for the first time in her life, Claire didn't care about the absence of an audience or the lack of extravagance. This was what she wanted: something real, something true. The officiant, a kind woman from the nearby town, smiled as they approached. "Shall we begin?" she asked, her voice gentle. Claire and Ethan exchanged a glance, both smiling. "Let's do it," Claire said, her heart swelling with a mixture of excitement and peace. As the officiant began to speak, Claire felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She glanced at Ethan, who was watching her with that same steady gaze, and she realized how much they had both changed since the day of their forced marriage. Back then, they had been strangers, two people thrown into a situation neither of them had wanted. But now they were something more. They were partners, equals, bound not by obligation but by choice. When it came time to say their vows, Claire took a deep breath and turned to face Ethan, her heart pounding in her chest. The words she had prepared felt inadequate, but she knew that what mattered most was the truth behind them. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft but clear, "when we first got married, I didn't understand what love was. I didn't know what it meant to be truly happy. I thought I had to chase after things: wealth, status, approval. But you showed me that happiness isn't about what you have. It's about who you share your life with. You've taught me more about love, kindness, and patience than I ever thought possible. And today I choose you. Not because I have to, but because I want to. I choose you to be my partner, my friend, and my love for the rest of my life." Ethan smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was steady, but there was a tenderness to it that made Claire's heart ache in the best way. "Claire," he said, his gaze locked on hers, "I never expected this. I never expected to find someone like you, especially in the way that we did. But from the moment we started this journey together, I knew that there was something special about you. You're strong, determined, and so full of life. And every day, you've shown me that love isn't about the grand gestures or the fancy things. It's about the little moments, the quiet ones, when we're just together. Choose you, Claire. I choose you today, tomorrow, and every day after that. And I'm so lucky to be standing here with you, knowing that this is just the beginning of our story." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as the officiant smiled and pronounced them husband and wife once again. There was no applause, no cheers from a crowd, but it didn't matter. This moment was perfect just the way it was. Ethan leaned in and kissed her gently, and Claire felt a sense of completeness settle over her. This was her life now, a life she had chosen not because of what it looked like to others, but because of what it felt like to her. As they walked back through the vineyard, hand in hand, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground, Claire glanced up at Ethan, her heart full of love and gratitude. "I never thought I'd find this," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Ethan smiled, his arm wrapping around her waist. "Neither did I." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the peaceful sounds of the vineyard surrounding them. There was no need for words. They both knew what this day meant: a new beginning, a fresh start, and the promise of a future filled with love, joy, and the simple beauty of life together. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Claire looked out at the vineyard, feeling the warmth of Ethan's hand in hers, and smiled. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be.